just 2 weeks into the new administration, I decided I would head down to Washington, D.C. myself. In part, I wanted to meet with James P. Moore of the Washington Institute. I sought out his expertise, particularly in the economics realm. He had served in that capacity under 2 previous Republican presidents. So perhaps reaching across the aisle, I could gain better perspective, not only for myself, but for listeners. After all, it's through dialogue and discourse that we gain better understanding. And we sat down to talk about, well, what to expect out of this new administration.
Always happy to come back to Washington, D.C. The city I always loved, Jim, and sometimes more than others, admittedly, but I did want to come sit down with you, have a conversation across the aisle, as it were, about politics, about what we're seeing right now, 2 weeks into the 47th presidency. Is this business as usual?
You know, it's interesting. I have been in Washington since literally the first day that Jimmy Carter was sworn into office. So I've had a lot of years to be able to watch the city move in one direction and another. It is clear that in time, the bureaucracy of Washington has grown more and more. We've taken on different kinds of projects that maybe our founding fathers never would have thought of, and that have been added to the budget and to the policies of America. And it was that concern that I think brought President Trump to office. People were concerned that things weren't being done in the way that they felt that they should have been. And what has happened in a very short period of time, I mean a very short period of time, is that these executive orders have produced a new process, a new era in the history of our country.
But here's the question I have. Will they stick, or are they just more of his marketing tactics of shock and awe?
I've often said that when Donald Trump first came to office, he was trying to figure out where the men's room was. He doesn't need to know where the men's room is now. He knows exactly where it is, and he knows exactly what he wants to do. And during this transition, he put together quite a few notions of what he wanted to see done. And those have manifested themselves in these executive orders. We have not had a president of the United States who put out so many executive orders in such a quick period of time. But that's been part of the problem. It's been the notion that compromise sometimes leads to anything less than a dramatic play to the future and the needs of the people. And so this constant compromise is seen in some quarters as creating mediocrity. And that's something that I think has been a concern. And the last thing that Donald Trump can ever be accused of, and that's mediocrity in terms of where he wants to see this country go.
I think we can both agree that America is looked to as this great experiment in democracy. And certainly, I know that's the way my friends in Europe and overseas view this country, and they'll also admit that we're probably the youngest one on the block. I always like to say we're more like that spoiled only child, and at this point we're in our tweens or teens, and we're really acting up and acting out. I worry, will we come through that okay? A lot of the rest of the world is wondering the same thing. Will American democracy survive?
Make no mistake about it, the United States continues to be the extraordinary power of the world over even China. And yes, China is nipping at the heels, but the fact is that the United States is going to be in this position for a long time to come. And what happens in these next 4 years will have a dramatic effect on not only the American people, but on people from all over the world, whether it's the European Union, it's the ASEAN countries in Asia, whether it's South America, it really will.
With China, is there a real threat, and is it more an issue under this president than it has been with past presidents?
I was the host for one of the very first trade delegations that ever came to the United States from China. It was headed up by the mayor of Shanghai. And in those days, they walked in the door with Mao suits on. And you realize that this was a different country, a different people than what we were used to. And in a rather short period of time, they changed dramatically. I can still remember watching the news in the evening and seeing the streets of Beijing in which everybody was on a bicycle. And there was very little in the way of automotive transportation. But China has, in a relatively short time, despite its mantra of patience, has done some extraordinary things. This recent event in which DeepSeek came into play and challenged American know-how in the area of artificial intelligence was certainly a telling moment for American companies to understand how competitive they are and will be. And so China is certainly a country that we have got to be concerned about. We have to be concerned on a political basis, on a military basis, and of course on an economic basis. And as we saw, we have tariffs that have now been imposed on China, and China reacted unlike Canada and Mexico by saying, okay, we'll put tariffs on you. And so it really was a telling moment, and we're going to continue to have a lot of those.
With the tariffs, particularly with China, is this a real threat? Is this a real issue?
President Trump makes it clear that he believes that he has a wonderful relationship with the presidency of China and that they can work through these kinds of things for the betterment of both countries. But we've got to realize that we're dealing with two very different systems, autocracy versus democracy. And
which one is us?
Some people are asking that question, but how this all comes out in the wash is really a challenge to be able to conceive, to be able to figure out where is this road going, and it doesn't take away from the fact that the United States and China cannot get along. But the question is, how is that going to happen? How are our leaders going to deal with it? How are our people going to deal with it? And we'll just have to see. These coming days, quite frankly, are going to tell the tale of what this is going to look like over the next 4 years that President Trump is in power, because he has taken some very strident stands with China, and the question is, does this stick, or do we find a way to be able to get around this so that we can work together in cooperation with one another and competition with one another?
Do tariffs really work, though?
Well, interestingly enough, the President has referenced President McKinley, who served as president over 100 years ago. But I think the more apt example of what tariffs can ultimately do is the Smoot-Hawley Act that took place in the early 1930s. Herbert Hoover was president, but there was a Senator Smoot and a Congressman Hawley from Oregon and the state of Washington who had been very concerned about their wood lumber people. And it was clear that Canada was dumping an awful lot of softwood lumber on the American people. And so they imposed a tariff that was to essentially penalize Canada from selling us too much in the way of lumber. But then somebody got the great idea, why don't we go ahead and do this for all products? And so Senator Smoot and Congressman Hawley went ahead and worked with Congress to see that these incredible tariffs were imposed on other countries as well as Canada. And at the end of the day, it deepened the Great Depression.
Are we about to see some very harsh economic realities as the American public?
I'm afraid that if we continue to put our foot on the pedal in trying to increase tariffs and we don't find compromise, particularly with our allies, some are predicting that the European Union is going to be next, we're going to suffer a consequence. And we think that inflation was high over the past 4 years. Look out.
So no matter what, that is the forecast.
No question. You cannot all of a sudden have products that have been coming into the American household and all of a sudden say you're going to come up with 25% more in the cost that's involved. Either the producer here in the United States has got to absorb the cost, or that company has got to see that it's absorbed by the consumer. And in most instances, it'll be taken up by the consumer himself or herself.
I have to imagine, though, to some degree, can we look at these tariffs as a retraining of the American public in terms of our own buying habits? Are we trying to get Americans at this point almost forcing their hand to turn over that product before they buy it and say, where was this made? The only thing I worry there is the American manufacturing aspect already in place in which to begin to meet the demand?
Quite frankly, I was out the other day and was looking, buying a fairly large product, and the first thing I asked the salesperson was, where was this made? And the reason for that was because I was concerned about the fact that I was going to have to pay more if I waited a couple of weeks than I would at that particular moment. And when I found out that it was made in France, I said, phew, okay. But I also realized that France may be in the middle of all this in the days to come. So it's really going to make a difference.
Having an ear of the Republican Party, is there a role that you're playing within this? Is there a way that you can help influence maybe some form of policy, because I think we're waiting particularly for an economic policy that this president ran on. Is there a way that you're preparing to lean in and help try and influence in a rational manner?
Well, first of all, I think the lessons learned are going to come real fast. This is not something that we're going to be trying to figure out 2 years from now. And one of the things that I think is most striking about these tariffs, particularly with Canada and Mexico, and that is that in the case of Canada, it is over fentanyl, and in the case of Mexico, it's over immigration. The president of Mexico has agreed to send 10,000 more troops in addition to the 15,000 that they have on the border to withstand the immigration that's coming not just from Latin America, but also from India, and a few people as well from China. And so tariffs in the past have always been an economic tool to fight an economic situation. But now we're expanding it and trying to really pummel these countries over the head. And so I don't think we're going to have to wait too long to see what the result is. President Trump has given both Canada and Mexico 30 days to be able to prove that what they've said, and we'll see indeed if they have done that. If they don't, it's going to be a horrible situation. But I have a feeling that it'll work. For example, Canada is going to have a brand new director of fentanyl who will be literally overseeing. They never had that before. We don't have anything quite like that ourselves. But it's interesting the response that's come to be able to withstand the kind of pressure that are coming from Donald Trump.
Well, you have such a deep involvement, as we've talked about, not only from your past political posts, but also from the perspective of the Washington Institute that gets government, business, and society working together. But what about us, local citizenry? What can we be doing? What should we be doing? And to what avail?
I think watching the stock market, I think seeing what happens with interest rates, I think those sorts of things, and quite frankly, people going to the grocery store and saying, you know, I purchased eggs last week and it was this price, and and bread and milk, and so I think that the American people are, we need to give them a lot more credit than sometimes people give them credit for. They're the ones who are going to be standing with picket signs if they don't seem to have been able to achieve the new course in the road that Donald Trump made clear he wanted to provide the American people and that they're expecting to see happen.
Do you think there, for better or for worse, might be then this new coming of we the people getting remotivated, and not on the level of Jan 6, of course, but getting remotivated, reactivated, and re-engaged beyond just, I voted for the guy, let's give him a chance?
Yes, sure. And I think an awful lot of people said that to themselves. I think the proof is in the pudding for them, and I think that they are going to be patient, but only up to a certain point. And that if we don't deliver the goods, as they say, then, for example, in 2 years, we've got a brand new election of members of Congress, both from the House, all of them in the House, and the Senate. And the history has shown us that the party in power occupying the White House will lose a minimum of 22 seats in the House of Representatives. And if we don't see that there is proof of improvement in this period of time, there is going to be a shellacking of the Republican congressmen and senators on Capitol Hill.
Jim, I got to ask, what should Democrats be doing?
Wake up! They need to wake up. They need to get away from the sleeping at the switch and to be able to have a serious discussion about what it is what the message was that came out of this last election. I'm afraid that sometimes it's just kind of goodbye to that, and well, the Democratic Party has just elected a brand new chairman, and he's going to have some hard talks going on with the members of Congress, but they lost their way, and it's really is no fault but their own, and they could have come up with a different message. Might not have changed the direction of the election, but quite frankly, they let all this slip from their hands, and it was from their standpoint regrettable.
We've talked a lot about tariffs and their implications overseas with our up until now partners, but also how that's going to come back on us. Let's look at the federal budget and the cuts that are going on now. Are these the smartest and best way to tackle something I think we all agree on? Federal spending has gone crazy, it's gone berserk, but is this the best way of handling this? Well, again, it's a little bit of what I was mentioning earlier, the old adage, run fast and break a lot of things. This notion that things have gotten so out of control that the only way to deal with it is to strike out quickly and then try to figure out how to put it all back together. Now, some would argue that that's not the way to go, but that's what's happening, and we're going to have to figure out how this ultimately works. There, for example, is an incredible organization called Management Advisory Group that has just come up with what they refer to as Federalism 2.0. And they argue that we have really lost our way from our founding fathers in the notion that we really are not fully appreciating the difference between centralization and decentralization. We today are 50 states and some territories, and each state has a very different way to be able to deal with the problems and the challenges that its constituents are having to contend with. But there's concern, for example, when I was working on Capitol Hill, there was the creation of the Department of Education. In the old days, education was taken care of on the state level, and was believed by some that it was well placed to be able to have it decentralized that way. But there were others who believed that we ought to centralize it, and that's exactly what happened under President Carter. It became the Department of Education. But now, after this period of time has passed, it's believed that local governments and states should be taking on that task. And so, we'll see what happens. And I do believe that in the not too distant future, we'll see that the Department of Education indeed departs. But this group that I'm mentioning have been doing an extraordinary job because they have been in government before. They've been in Democratic and Republican administrations. They've seen how it works, much the way that I've seen how it works. And they've come to the conclusion that there's a need to be able to reduce the number of people that are involved in the government, the bureaucrats, and that there's a need to be able to understand the approach to addressing the policies and the concerns of the American people. And I applaud what they're doing, and I'm hoping that they will be listened to very carefully by the Trump administration. Well, I worry that with Elon Musk, though, do we not end up reinforcing a distrust of business working with government that I think for a while P3s, public-private partnerships, were working around demonstrating, no, we can do some good. Have we now basically just thrown the baby out with the bathwater?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society, which I head, came into existence with the notion that, that quite frankly, the challenges of the world today cannot be addressed by business alone, by government alone, by society alone, that it is a collaboration that needs to take place. But certainly what has happened in just the past few weeks, actually, is that we have a very different approach than I had envisioned. Elon Musk, for example, certainly is the most powerful business leader that has ever found his way into the Oval Office. And it's interesting, but he has an office now. Now, he has not been elected. He has not been even appointed in the sense of with a confirmation. And he has an office in the old executive office building, which I know so well, which is right next to the White House. But he has several other offices where he has associates. And what did he do? But he made sure that beds were put into each of these offices so that they could sleep and then maybe 3 or 4 hours and then get back up and get back to their desks and keep working. There is this real desire on the part of Elon Musk and his people to be able to do anything and everything they can to reform the government. He has come up with statistics like he wants to see 75% of the federal workforce, for example, take off, and that we can work our government with far fewer people than what we have. Some of these have been tremendously daring. And I don't think all this is going to go through, but he sure is going to try. But that's this combination of having these business leaders. These are not just wealthy business leaders. These are at the top of their game and the top of the chain. And all of them are billionaires. And millionaires really are kind of at the bottom of the rung.
The other area that you have tremendous expertise in, and I know you're very involved in a project right now, is the Ukraine. And I don't think a lot of folks understand exactly why America should be and has been investing so heavily, obviously, not just in armament, but also investing in the future of the Ukraine. Let's focus on that region.
Well, first of all, Ukraine, you know, has an extraordinary history, and I think that Donald Trump, President Trump, really does not want to be seen as the president who lost Ukraine. American taxpayers have spent billions with a big old B to be able to allow them to defend themselves, to provide humanitarian aid, to be able even to have the wheels of government work in Ukraine. After all, Ukraine represents a European nation that was a sovereign nation. And ironically, also, we should remember that when Ukraine disassociated itself from the Soviet Union, under President Clinton, it signed an agreement that literally withdrew all of its nuclear weapons to Russia. And so, you know, putting all these pieces together, it's clear that Ukraine has really been placed in this very difficult situation where President Putin completely miscalculated the Ukrainians, believing that within 1 week he would be able to completely dominate the country. And now we've had this go on for 3 years come February 2025. And as a result, President Trump, recognizing that there are some very positive things about Ukraine that can in fact benefit the United States, like rare minerals like titanium and lithium, or even producing. I mean, the Ukrainian people, quite honestly, in this day and age of technology, which we also are having to put into place in what we're doing as a government and our own commercial interests, that they could actually be a big help to industry here in the United States. Everything from electric cars, to turbines. It's incredible. So I think at the end of the day, Russia will have been seen as having made one of the great historic mistakes of the century. And it's not going to take away from the fact that Ukraine will remain and retain its status as a fully sovereign, independent country.
Although we do have his current proclamations about Gaza at this point, which doesn't necessarily leave a lot of hope. I mean, it almost sounds like his intention will build the next Disney World of the Mediterranean there. So one wonders, with his lack of sensitivity and awareness and his industrialism, where we'll end up in Gaza, no?
Well, Gaza is a hard pill to swallow, the notion that the United States would take it over. Of course, we've recently, heard efforts to be able to take over Canada, to take over Panama Canal, to take over Greenland, which of course is a huge mass. But in the case of Gaza, there are some real concerns on the part of Republicans and Democrats alike, and world leaders have been admonishing the United States for even considering turning it into the Riviera of the Arab world. Having walked in Gaza, it is really a sad place to walk. But then again, we have a president of the United States who knows real estate real well, and has realized the potential that Gaza has. But the concern, of course, on some and that is that essentially Israel would take it over, but that's going to have to be worked out, and that is probably the most contentious land consideration that the president has come up with so far. What's happening in the Oval Office is having an impact around the world.
Are we in any imminent threat of dictatorship?
I truly believe in the miracle of America, in the potential of the American people. I know that DEI is not popular right now, but I will say this, that America has enjoyed the prosperity and the great hope that it has because of the diversity of its people. To be able to see Indians from India, to be able to see so many individuals that have made this country great. It's extraordinary. We can't forget, for example, that President Trump's mother was born and raised in Scotland. We can't forget the fact that two of his wives were from Eastern Europe. We can't forget, that Elon Musk, for example, was born and raised in South Africa. Mm-hmm. And they were attracted to come to America for a variety of reasons. And so they're bringing their talents here, and I think also their hopes. And if they fail along the way, then America absorbs that. It realizes what has happened, and it makes a change. But we're in the middle of that, and sometimes I wish that it had happened a little bit later on, or it had already happened. But we're the ones who have inherited that, and we'll see what happens.
Well, Jim, you certainly have given me some reassurances. It's always good to have this level of bipartisan conversation, not shouting match. So thank you so much for taking the time and giving me your point of view on this.
Wonderful. Thank you. Enjoyed it very much.